Thanks, Federico, for the invitation and the introduction. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Great. Well, you heard the introduction. I can dive straight into it. So it is a paper about strategy, the growth strategy, and with the idea of enriching that thinking. Right? And I'll explain what the argument of the paper is, and and I'll go through the argument. So perhaps this is all sort of stuff that you already are familiar with, but in scholarship and thinking about the growth strategy, usually you find these three broad types of strategies. So there's so-called prefiguration, so the realization of alternatives in the present. So this is usually in a very diverse sort of set of actual realizations of change, like from eco-villages to alternative currencies to community-supported agricultures to all sorts of cooperatives and other collectives, usually on a local level, but often also interconnected across many, many locations. So that's one type of strategy that tries to create alternatives in the cracks of the system. There's counter-hegemonic mobilization, so this is really resisting capitalism and the growth economy. So it's about protest, it's about sort of more ruptural sort of type of interventions to, again, resist and disrupt the type of growth economy. And the paper is about the third sort of pillar, or the third type of strategy, is the non-reformist reform. It's a bit of a weird term, but the term was introduced in the 60s by André Gorz, a political ecologist, who was grappling with sort of the difficulties of finding a way to advance change. It wasn't about degrowth at the time, but more like actually what he had in mind was a socialist revolution. But he was writing in the 60s, towards the end of the 60s, and on the one hand, he saw sort of type of the ability of capitalism to adjust itself and to sort of reform itself, right, and to stay the same. On the other hand, he saw sort of this socialist revolution, as one would think of it, sort of quite sort of the hopes of that revolution sort of fading, and the impossibility of that revolution. So say, okay, is there a way to work from within the system, but also in ways that are transformative? And the idea of non-reformist reform is of essentially ways of reforming the system, but to transform key elements of it, key aspects of it. So in the growth thinking, non-reformist reforms have taken quite an important role. There's here a short list, but there's many more types of policies. Usually it's policies, really, like reduction of working hours, reforms of public finance, right, to make it more green, universal basic income and universal basic services, things like that, right? And they are not exclusive policy proposal for degrowth. They don't only have the degrowth stamp on it. So many other also political parties or other movements might sort of embrace some of these policies at least. And the idea is, in this quote by Georgios Kallis and colleagues, but the idea is that this type of reforms, even if they seem moderate when they're taken on their own, but they together and in a sort of in an overarching policy that really aims to maintain well-being while reducing resource and use and environmental impact, might really change the structure of the system, right? They challenge, the type of policy challenge some of the core logics of the system, and they sort of, the idea is that they would transform in different sectors or different systems or subsystems of the economy. Also in the degrowth literature, we find a lot. Oops, what happened? Here. All right, I'll go on and here it is. So what is in that sort of literature, right, the degrowth literature on non-reformist reform, we find a lot of emphasis on planning and democratic sort of decision making. In particular, a certain understanding of democracy, which is democratic deliberation, type of consensus-based type of democratic deliberation. These are just two quotes from Matthias Schmelzer and Schmelzer and Hofferberg's work, but there's other similar quotes from other authors. And of course, there's, there are reasons why there's such an emphasis on democracy and on planning, right? Democracy is from a normative perspective, desirable, more so in our times. And planning, of course, there's a lot to learn also, as Matthias Schmelzer argues, right? From a lot of experiences in urban planning, economic planning, and so forth, where, there's a lot to learn there to design a different economy. However, and here comes sort of the critique that spurs this paper, I think that the emphasis really on the democratic deliberation and planning when we think of non-reformist reforms is problematic in at least three ways. First, it underestimates the lack of favorable conditions. So it underestimates the lack of broad political support for degrowth, the state's unwillingness or inability to act, and societal discord. It reflects a lack of preparedness for strategic compromise. And it conflates really non-reformist reforms with this consensus-based understanding of democracy and planning. And so the risk here is really that that type of approach obscures the condition, social and political conditions from within which any transformation, including degrowth transformation, necessarily needs to take place. So we need essentially to theorize degrowth transformation in ways that take those conditions, present conditions, into consideration, and not idealize essentially the possibility to all sit together around the table and decide the economy and what are the priorities for the economy, and to design all economic systems around that. Because there's no single we, there's no single table around which we can all sit, and that's not how economies change, that's not how societies change. So the paper tries to unpack these issues and then to propose some thoughts about the way forward. Okay. Okay, that's the risk that I just mentioned. Okay, don't need that. Okay, so the question of the paper essentially is whether and how a particular theoretical perspective, which I will introduce in a moment, but it's called partial political settlements, can provide valuable ideas and advance non-reformist reforms for a degrowth social-ecological transformation. The partial political settlement perspective essentially posits that transformation often involve uncomfortable compromise to realize a minimal level of productive cooperation among actors who can influence a policy outcome, but where otherwise there will be intractable conflict. So there's a lock-in, and how do you move from that lock-in and that conflict, right? So there's a minimum level of cooperation to a compromise that is imperfect, is partial, but moves things forward in directions that can be transformative. So it's a way to bring discord and conflict into the theorization of transformation rather than to put it aside and assume that it can be solved at some point in the future or that it doesn't exist altogether. So it's a partial settlement perspective. It's a pragmatic way to try to deal with these difficult conditions for change. I will get back to that also with some examples, but let me say that essentially my argument hinges on two claims. The first one is that when we think of non-reformist reform, we should move from the idea of the formal policy planning to a more agonistic and emancipatory perspective that includes really political mobilization around the policy-making process. And I'll develop that. And the second claim is that non-reformist reform must be situated in a broader political strategy that envisions ways to address exactly that lack of favorable conditions for the growth. So I will discuss these three issues to set the scene, and then I'll get back to these partial political settlements and see how they can help us think through sort of this degrowth strategy. So the first point is that the fact that this literature tends to underestimate the lack of favorable conditions. The first point is that the lack of broad political support for degrowth. I don't think I'm saying anything sort of particularly surprising. Degrowth is not the most appealing or the most sort of publicly accepted vision or concept out there. This has been discussed by various scholars. Bo Hansen has a nice paper about sort of conditions that would favor degrowth transformation, but also several other authors have discussed it through the lens of either legitimacy, acceptance, etc., etc. So that's obvious, and it's clearly a barrier when we think about those policies, those non-reformist reforms that I mentioned earlier. The second one is the role of the state, and there's been a number of interesting papers about the role of the state in degrowth and degrowth transformation, and this is very nice. On the other hand, there's a certain, and the state can play a central role, of course, right? Especially when we think about non-reformist reform, so that particular type of strategy. However, the assumption is always that there's a state that has the ability to make, implement, enforce central decisions for a collectivity. So there's a certain idealization of the state that probably reflects where theories come from, right? Where degrowth theories come from Europe and even certain parts of Europe. However, if you zoom out and look at the whole world, actually the state often is characterized by limited statehood or criminal governance. We find situations where the state, let me give you the very short definition of limited statehood. So areas of limited statehood are parts of a country in which central authorities, so governments, lack the ability to implement or enforce rules and decisions, and or in which the legitimate monopoly over the means of violence is lacking, at least temporarily. And you can think of areas where drug cartels govern certain whole regions of countries, mafia-like organizations again control whole regions. At smaller scale, urban gangs and other criminal organizations. Or simply, you can also think of areas where simply the state has not a strong presence. A lot of the areas in Colombia where I've done research about food systems and peasant communities, they're not necessarily characterized by the presence of violent actors like guerrilla groups or criminal organizations, but simply the state is not very present, right? A local school is the only presence of the state that you see. There's not even a medical post, or let alone a police office or station, right? So in those areas, and they're very vast, it's difficult to think of a state that can really enforce any type of reform. And so criminal governance are those areas where governance is actually rests not only on sort of state authorities, but also on these other actors, that usually come with criminal actors, and there's interactions between state actors and criminal governance to co-govern a region. And this is, again, it characterizes a large part of our planet. And the third condition that is a barrier for non-reformist reform is discord. So we tend to think of transformation that based on consensus, on the ability to steer processes of change. We sort of tend to undermine or underestimate the existence of frictions, yeah, in societies, pushbacks, resistance. Tend to think of a lot of roadmaps for sustainability, for example. Focus on particular leverage points that can be, again, levered and intervened upon to optimize change, and you can add more initiatives or policies or values without having to necessarily remove, those that are unsustainable. So that's a bit the idea, right? That informs a lot of sustainability thinking, and I would argue to a large extent also degrowth thinking about transformation. But in fact, society is characterized by dissensus, so fundamental disagreements, not only in terms of interest, but also in terms of really normative positions. Change actually is more like emergent rather than can be controlled, right? There's a lot of friction, again, resistance, pushback. There's often limited influence of actors, and that actors can have, exactly because the systems are so complex and so characterized so much by friction. And then you need a lot of subtraction also, phasing out of unsustainable institutions, technology, practice, and that creates even more discord and more friction because it goes against the win-win type of narrative of change. And again, this is sort of a barrier to thinking about non-reformist reforms. The second point that I discuss in the paper here, in terms of issues for non-reformist reforms, is the fact that the literature on non-reformist reforms tend to disregard the possibility and the value of compromise. And this is a point that actually, when I was preparing this paper, the paper by Richard Berntaler came out, and I fully subscribe to that argument. So he laments exactly this point, the fact that with the growth scholar, we tend to value a lot consensus, but that this essentially is a limiting factor. It's problematic because the search for compromises, and therefore the need to engage with those who don't agree with the growth, even if that leads to non-ideal situations, is, according to Berntaler, who builds on more literature, is really a key to hegemony, a key to spread degrowth and make it a more hegemonic sort of ideology. And this has been similar arguments, sort of the need to really engage with those who disagree, right? With degrowth has been made by other scholars in various different venues, not necessarily only articles, but also discussion, blogs, etc. And the barrier to do that, so to move beyond essentially the consensus-based thinking, is really, according to Berntaler, a sort of disdain for democratic forms that are not consensus-building. So representative democracy is frowned upon by many thinkers in degrowth, for example, right? And that, prevents essentially the appreciation of the fact that compromise can be used strategically in certain situations. And to that sort of argument, I add the fact that we have actually evidence from both European and Latin American movement, that's at least the regions where which I'm most familiar with, of actually movements engaging with the state and often also with criminal states, going back to the criminal governance point. Movements that are able to adapt their strategy and that manage to produce change, sometimes more transformative, sometimes less transformative, but still change in the direction that they desire, through and not despite the engagement with the state. And that really is it's very inspiring, I think, because it shows actual sort of cases. I can't go into the specifics, but believe me, in a sense, in the paper there's a number of cases listed and with references and everything. But that's sort of, yeah, the idea that actually engaging with the state is possible also from the position of a social movement. Of course, it's about adapting and also being aware of when compromise is not an option to defend certain integrity of the movement. Eh? That's part of the game in a sense. And the implication here that it's, instead of trying to resolve conflict and create consensus, we need to think about democracy in different ways. So we need to think about democracy as the expression of disagreement, so more in agonistic terms rather than in consensus building terms. However, and this is a weak spot, again, in our times, as Federico mentioned, yeah, all the sort of the right-wing sort of turn. A condition to do this is that political institutions allow conflict, yeah, to remain respectful. So you need to be able to have institutions where you have adversaries, you don't have enemies. So you have other parts, groups, movements, parties, whatever, where that you can disagree respectfully, and this doesn't mean that if you disagree you need to remove those enemies from the system, right? And this is, however, where we tend to go, right, with this, again, recent developments in our society. So that's a condition for them. Okay, the last point, and here we link to that. So non-reformist reforms have been sort of conflated with this idea of policy making, essentially, right? But also already in Gord's proposal, and more sort of, which is being revised by some scholars recently, it's more than that. It's more than policies. Yeah, we need to think of non-reformist reforms as more emancipatory moments and processes. So, yes, these are reforms that try to change essential elements of the system, but they also foment new social formation. And the key element is that they shift the power of balance. So the reforms are not non-reformist, right? They're not transformational if they don't undermine prevailing power relations that characterize that system. And the focus is on the outcome, but also on the process. And so I have a table here, but I'll give you an example. So if you think of land reforms, say land reforms to support a transition of the food system towards more small scale farming, agroecological farming, which would be in broad lines also aligned with a degrowth transformation. Now, you can think of those land reforms as being characterized by expropriation of from large landowners who might not even be using the land, but just speculating with land. Restructuring the funding schemes and the incentives around that are based on land. And the introduction of measures that counter and hinder the reaccumulation, the accumulation of land as property, right? This would be a type of reform which we would recognize as non-reformist reform, okay? If it doesn't do that, so if land reform that only redistributes public land, or that doesn't really introduce structural changes to the funding and the sort of the incentives and the supports that is attached to land, or that doesn't introduce structural measures to counter the reaccumulation of land, that wouldn't count as a non-reformist reform. That would be a liberal reform that tries to solve the problem of the system, to fix it rather than to challenge the underlying sort of logic. And again, it's the outcome, but it's also the process. So in a non-reformist reform, what you have is a mobilization around the issue that raises awareness, that creates capacity for among farmers and their organizations, for example, but also other actors that might coalesce and support. And that is empowerment for further action in the future, okay? The way liberal reforms are normally done is more in a more technical way, behind closed doors by experts, right? That depoliticize the issue and don't create any capacity among the actors involved, any capacity for further change later on. So the outcome, so how land is redistributed or not, matters. But also the process to get there matters in terms of an emancipatory perspective on non-reformist reforms. However, so, and then here comes the sort of the proposal, or the sort of the further sort of addition to this thinking is, how do we actually implement non-reformist reforms that are emancipatory, transformative, right? And the discussion itself doesn't give us many sort of hints. Yeah. Yes, we have the element of power, which is crucial. Yes, but how practically, how do you move towards? Yeah, how do you move towards those type of reforms? And here, what I do in the paper, I bring in this perspective, partial political settlements, which together with James Patterson and Rakim, two colleagues in Utrecht, we propose for sustainability transformations more generally. But in this paper, I'm sort of bringing it more specifically into thinking about the growth strategy. And well, you see a short definition there of partial political settlements, but the idea is really that often transformations really involve these small steps that are uncomfortable, they are non-ideal, but that help to deal with the lock-in, right? So the conflictual situation, which essentially is a lock-in. So it's a way to try to work with that discord and with that conflict, rather than assuming that it can go away, right? And that it will go away. A lot of the inspiration comes from another type of transition or transformation, which is that from conflict to post-conflict, or conflict to peace. So a lot of the sort of the inspiration really comes from post-conflict transition and peace-building literature. And in those cases, it's a similar situation. So you have a societal transition, right? And you have discord, which is, in that case, it really leads to wars and conflict, right? And you don't try to resolve that conflict, because the conflict will probably be there and stay, but it's about dealing with that conflict and finding ways to sort of continue disagreement, but in different forms, and make it productive to open up further options later on. And that's the idea of a settlement. You don't resolve the conflict, you don't resolve that discord, you settle it, even only partially, but the very fact that you settle it means that other options for action are open, okay? There are a few elements to that idea. So the first, it involves uncomfortable compromise. So it's not only a negotiation of interests between those who are involved, but it's also often about values and normative positions that essentially the parties need to live with. Yeah, you have to live with a situation that is deeply uncomfortable. And again, this comes also from that peace-building literature, right? The concrete examples where conflict are solved, yeah, or settled, if not solved, through these experiences. It's partial settlement because it's always incomplete, right? It's exactly because it's a compromise. It's never an ideal situation for none of the parties involved, right? And this is a point that also Bernd Thaler makes. A compromise is non-ideal by definition, yeah, for all the parties involved. If only one part involved is compromising, then it means we're not talking about the same thing, okay? A real compromise is uncomfortable to all the parties involved. And that's a limit, if you want, but it's a possibility because it makes it generates that openness of the settlement for further action. And because it's not ideal and it's incomplete and it's uncomfortable, you need continuity. So it's not one settlement or one, if you think of reforms, no one reform will not solve any issue per se. You need probably to forge several settlements to really make a transformation, okay? So you need that continuity over time. And the continuity is not only in terms of the formal policy making, but it's really spread out in society. It's in the public space, it's in schools, it's in factories, it's in offices, it's at home, it's in neighborhoods. So, and that again resonates a lot with the peace building literature, where yes, you have the peace agreement that is signed by the heads of governments or by the leaders of the factions But actually, so that's only one element of a peace or a post-conflict transition. The real transition happens through that and through the practice of a more peaceful society in the everyday life, again, across many different arenas, yeah, of civic life. And that support the agreement, so it's a feedback, right? The practice of a more peaceful society supports the legitimacy of the peace agreement, and the formal agreement sort of supports the everyday practice. And in all of this, Gord says that about non-reformist reforms. We say this about sustainability transition, and the peace building literature says that about post-conflict transition. The line between transformation or co-option is very thin, okay? So narrative interpretation of what is happening is very important. As I made the example of land reforms, it's a very thin line between those reforms going in the direction of potential transformation or going really in the direction of co-option and fixing the system as it is. And the same for many other examples. So the ability to create narratives that frame that particular settlement, that particular moment, as a step towards a certain type of transformation or a step towards solving a problem within the system, that's very important. And of course, not all the actors involved have the same power to create those narratives and to make them dominant. So that's an important point also to keep in mind. Now, all of this is very abstract, so I have two examples in the paper. I don't have time for both. You will tell me, Federico, but I'll give you this one first. And then I only have 2 slides to conclude, so then you tell me about time. So one example is the Representation of the People Act. In 1918 in the UK, but there were similar pieces of legislation also in many other countries around the same time. This is the act, so the law that grants the right to vote to women, but not to all women. As you see in the cartoon, probably it's too small, but only to women aged 30 or above, and only to women who essentially either owned property or were married to someone who owned property, to make it simple. So 22% of British women were not granted the vote through this law. They were still not able to vote, despite the approval of this piece of legislation. Now, as you can imagine, and as you probably know, right, the act itself is a sort of the result of decades of mobilization by movements, right, feminist movements, but also across society, from journalists to teachers to workers, right? It's not only the feminist leaders, but it's again more widespread in society. It was recognized, in a sense, as an achievement. Okay, so in that sense, you can say, yeah, it's a big moment. It's an important moment. At the same time, it was really a compromise. And from our perspective, it might not be so obvious, but at the time, there were people who were actually, even in the movements, they were quite upset by the law, exactly because it wasn't about granting the right to vote to all the women. So it was actually, by some activists, was seen as a failure. And of course, it was a compromise for those who were against granting the right to vote to women, right? So for them also, it was a compromise. And you can also say it was a compromise more generally because it was only about the vote, so one political right. It wasn't about all the issues about gender equality and inequality that were also on the agenda of these movements. So one of the National Union of Women Suffrage Society called it an imperfect scheme that can pass, right? To give you the sense of this compromise. It didn't resolve the conflict, so it was imperfect, it was partial, and it didn't solve. Now, it's not like in 1919 everybody was happy and agreeing on the situation of the political rights. No, those who were against and had campaigned against this law continued after the law to try to delay its implementation, or to sort of obstruct its implementation. Those who had been in favor, kept mobilizing. Okay, so that's the openness of that particular moment. And the law, so if you want, it's a reform, right, and it's a settlement, was transformative in the sense that women started to have more legitimacy, more generally in society. So it was a sort of a establishment of legitimacy. They started to access positions, public offices, and other leading roles in society. Okay, thanks to this. It expanded essentially opportunities for women. So it was again about empowering women in society, and that's the outcome. The process, because of the mobilizations around the right to vote, a lot of collective consciousness was created, organizing capacity, networks and coalitions, not only within this movement, but also other allied movements, right? Action repertoires and tactics that had been tested and used and proved effective or not, right, in the campaigns, etc. And this, again, is about empowering, and it was key in the following years when the movement kept and the coalitions kept mobilizing. And only 10 years after, so in 1928, in another act, the Equal Franchise Act, was approved, and that was the unconditional, so the granting unconditional vote to all the citizens, regardless of gender or other conditions. Okay, so it took 10 years to get to the, to the full transformation, if you like. So that was a step towards, right? That's the idea of the partial settlement. And okay, do I have time for another example? Okay, let me give you a more recent example, which is also, in a sense, a bit more less successful. So that's the National Policy for Agroecology and Organic Production, Brazil. Brazil is seen as, in the agroecology sort of movement, as an example of success, in a sense, because probably nowhere in the world, as in Brazil, agroecology has been institutionalized, okay, in terms of policies, in terms of funding schemes and all knowledge system, etc., as in Brazil. So here, after the dictatorship in Brazil until the late 80s, it was very difficult to mobilize for any movement, not only for the agroecology movement. Then there was an opening, right, democratic opening, and that created the possibility also for the agroecology movement, but also for all sorts of other movements around food, essentially, and the environmental movement. So there's don't have time to go into the fine detail of that, but anyway, there was the possibility for movements, including the agroecology movement, to experiment with alternatives all over the country, to build knowledge systems, to build connections to local authorities, or and to mobilize also more at national level. Then what happened in the 90s, President Lula came to power. And after Lula, there was Dilma Rousseff. And they were from a left-wing party, okay? They had been activists themselves more in the workers and the trade unions and workers movement. And that was really a turning point, okay? So the mobilization, decades of mobilization, found a particular moment of opening in the government. And what Lula did was an innovation, an institutional innovation. So they really created new tables where really negotiations for policy and policy making took place. And the civil society and this movement sat at the table, okay? So you have really the idea of settling conflict. Conflict was still there because, of course, you had all those against these policies, against agroecology, politicians, the agribusiness, and other sort of interest in those interested in more in export, in exporting commodities, etc. But the policy was approved, and the policy was again a mixed feelings that were around the policy. So big sort of achievement in a sense, lots of ministries involved, lots of money and reallocation of funds, etc., involved. However, also a big compromise, because a lot of the demands were not included, right, in this policy. A lot of the movement's demands were not there. Also, a lot of the, so the agroecology policy was on top of the existing ones. So it didn't replace, for example, the government support for agribusiness. Okay, so the government was sort of was supporting agroecology, but was not detracting sort of support to agribusiness. So that's also a big sort of ambivalence there. So there were important advances, also again in terms of empowerment, in terms of sort of material empowerment. There were many more farmers who had access to resources and therefore could feed their family and therefore could liberate their time and use it for more action. But also symbolically, right? So the legitimacy, it was a big move for increasing legitimacy of agroecology in the country. That's why we talk globally of Brazil as a best practice, yeah, because of the legitimacy this had. And it was very open, so open. So it wasn't very structural, right? This policy was on top of the others. So what happened when Dilma Rousseff was, put out of power? Bolsonaro, first another government, then Bolsonaro government was in power. And they very easily dismantled this policy and all other sort of related policies for agroecology. So when the openness goes in the wrong direction in a sense, right? Different from the case of women's rights. However, now since 2 years, Lula went into power again, right? And there you can see a different type of openness again. So the fact that experience has existed, right, in the earlier 2000s and 2010s, offers the grounds now for restarting those processes or giving them another possibility, right? And to push again agroecology. And it's unclear yet how things might develop, but there is, so the gains that were then dismantled by the following governments were not totally lost again. So again, this imperfection and this need to think in terms of sort of a bit more longer term. All right. So I hope this gives you a sense of how the partial settlements sort of way of looking at transformation aligns with the non-reformist reforms. So there's this idea of sustaining efforts over time across multiple settlements and reforms. Settlements and reforms are incomplete, right? So however, they offer possibilities for future change. Yeah? There's the policy process, right? But there's also many different arenas involved. Yeah, the whole experimentation of agroecology, the whole practice of women equality and women participation in British society, etc. In both here, through partial settlements, we managed or tried to foreground discord and see, okay, how do actually the actors involved, how do they deal with this discord, rather than assuming that discord can be solved altogether. And the interpretation is very important, yeah? So the ability to sort of influence discourse around these policies, yeah, these reforms is very, very important. But definitely there's a decentering of deliberation and consensus building and planning, right? So it's a broader strategic approach of which reforms are an element. There's a number of risks and caveats. I get the sense that first of all, that we are out of time, and second, that this will come back in the Q&A, so I'll leave it out for now. And I will just conclude with probably 2 messages, so just to clarify in case that's not clear. But so the paper and this talk is not a call for diluting degrowth, right? So they say, calling for compromise as, dilute degrowth. No, but it's more and it's not a call to abandon other strategies, like for example, the sort of the attempt to create more cultural change in line with degrowth, or to think about planning models or other strategies that can support degrowth and post-growth societies. The goal is more to enrich the way we think about degrowth strategy. Okay, and again, my focus and my target has been on non-reformist reforms and a particular take, which is dominant in the literature, on a particular take in that. And really my concern, which I wanted to address, and I hope I've shown how I think about that, was really to think about degrowth transformation starting from society as it is, rather than from society as it should be, right? Because we can conceive all sorts of fantastic, schemes of things and ways to redesign the economy, etc. But that's not how change happens historically. So how do we think of transformation from where we are somehow? And that was essentially what the paper and the presentation was about. Thanks a lot.